Canada, we have a tremendous deficit with Canada. We're not going to have that anymore. We can't do it. I don't know if it's good for them. As you probably know, I say you can always become a state. And if you're a state, we won't have a deficit. We won't have to tariff you, et cetera, et cetera. But Canada has been very tough to deal with over the years.
Donald Trump isn't the first American leader to have this thought. Because believe it or not, America has already invaded Canada more than once. Not just planned it, not just talked about it. We sent troops in. We fought battles. We occupied cities. And the best part? We almost won. So if Trump really wanted to take Canada, could he? Let's break down the real history of America's invasions of Canada and why it might not be as impossible as you think. Most people think of Canada as America's polite, friendly neighbor. But in the early days of the United States, Canada wasn't just another country. It was a threat. Why? Because Canada belonged to the British Empire, and back in the late 1700s and early 1800s, Britain was America's #1 enemy. So when the US went to war with Britain in 1812, Canada was an obvious target. American leaders figured, why not just take it? Their logic? Canada was right there, barely defended and full of British loyalists who surely didn't want to stay under British rule. President James Madison and Congress were so confident that they believed the war would be over in a matter of months. One congressman even said, the acquisition of Canada this year, as far as the neighborhood of Quebec, will be a mere matter of marching. Spoiler alert, it was not a mere matter of marching. In 1812, the US launched a full-scale invasion. 3 different American armies marching north, aiming to drive the British out and claim Canada as part of the United States. The idea was simple: overwhelm the British before they have time to react. Instead, it turned into one of the most embarrassing military failures in US history. First, American generals completely underestimated the British and their Native American allies. One US force, led by General William Hull, marched into Canada with 0 resistance, but then immediately panicked when British troops and native warriors under Tecumseh counterattacked. Instead of fighting, Hull surrendered his entire army without firing a shot. That's right, an entire American army gave up Yeesaw to a smaller British force. It was such a disaster that Hull was court-martialed and sentenced to death, though he was later pardoned. The other invasions didn't fare much better. Another American army was routed at the Battle of Queenston Heights. A third was repelled in the Battle of Chrysler's Farm. And by 1813, the entire invasion had collapsed. Instead of conquering Canada, America got pushed back and then had to fight to defend its own territory when the British counterattacked. So yeah, it didn't exactly go to plan. But here's the thing. This wasn't America's only attempt to take Canada. Because over a century later, the US military drew up new invasion plans. And this time, they were dead serious. By the 1930s, America wasn't just thinking about invading Canada. They had a full-scale, classified war plan to make it happen. It was called Project War Plan Red, and it wasn't some vague strategy. The US military drafted real battle maps, troop movements, and occupation plans, laying out exactly how the United States would invade, defeat, and take control of Canada. And this time the plan wasn't going to fail. Step 1. Seize Halifax. The first target was Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada's most important Atlantic port. Halifax controlled all British reinforcements from Europe. If the US could capture it quickly, the British wouldn't be able to send reinforcements. The plan called for a massive naval blockade to cut off supplies, a full-scale assault by the US Marines, and bombing runs to cripple Canada's defenses. With Halifax in American hands, Canada would be isolated. Step 2. Take out key cities. Next, the US planned to launch 3 major invasions, each targeting Canada's biggest cities. Troops from Detroit would invade Toronto. Those stationed in Buffalo would attack Niagara and Montreal, and those in Vermont would target Quebec City. The goal was to crush Canada's government before they had time to react. Step 3. Hold the West. Finally, US forces would sweep across Western Canada, securing cities like Winnipeg, Calgary, and Vancouver, locking down the entire country under American control. By the time Britain could even consider sending help, it would be too late. Canada would already be under the American flag. This wasn't just some plan sitting in a filing cabinet. The US ran actual military exercises based on War Plan Red. In the 1930s, the Army built secret air bases near the Canadian border, preparing for bombing raids on Montreal and Toronto. And here's the craziest part. Congress approved funding for it. In 1935, Congress allocated $57 million, over $1.3 billion today, to build military bases, war supplies, and airfields for an invasion of Canada. America wasn't just thinking about war with Canada, they were preparing for it. So what happened? Why didn't the US go through with it? One reason, World War II. Before the US could launch its attack, a much bigger war broke out. Germany invaded Europe, Japan took the Pacific, and suddenly, Britain wasn't an enemy. They were an ally. War Plan Red was quietly shelved, and by the time 1-2 ended, the US and Canada had become close military partners. But the plan itself? It was never officially declassified until 1974. For decades, Canadians had no idea their neighbors to the south had once drafted a plan to wipe their country off the map. So, could the US actually take over Canada today? It's complicated. On paper, if the US really wanted to take Canada by force, it wouldn't be much of a fight. The United States has the largest and most advanced military in the world. Canada's military is tiny by comparison, with just 71,000 active personnel compared to America's 1.3 million. The US Navy outnumbers and outguns Canada's entire fleet several times over. America's Air Force alone has 13,000 aircraft, while Canada has less than 400. In a conventional war, Canada wouldn't stand a chance. But that's not the full story. Because a US invasion of Canada wouldn't be about who has the bigger military. It would be about what happens next. If the US were to actually invade Canada, here's what would happen. NATO would step in. Canada is a core NATO member, and under Article 5, an attack on one NATO country is an attack on all of them. That means the UK, France, Germany, and every other NATO ally would be forced to respond. Suddenly, the US wouldn't just be fighting Canada, it would be facing a global war. So if invading Canada is so unrealistic, why does it keep coming up? Because the truth is, the US doesn't need tanks or missiles to control Canada. Without firing a single shot, the United States already holds enormous power over its northern neighbor. If the US ever cut off trade, Canada's economy would collapse overnight. The US is Canada's #1 trading partner, making up nearly 75% of Canada's total exports. The US also controls key industries like energy. Canada relies heavily on American investment to keep its oil and gas sector running. Even the biggest media and entertainment companies are either owned by or heavily dependent on American corporations. Hollywood, music, sports, even Canadian politics are shaped by the US more than many Canadians would like to admit. And that's not even to mention their military reliance on the US. Without US military backing, Canada would struggle to defend itself from even minor threats. At the end of the day, Trump doesn't need an invasion. He just needs leverage. Trade disputes, America wins. Military cooperation, America leads. Political influence, America dominates. Canada isn't the 51st state, but in many ways it's already under US control. Now, the only question is, if Trump wanted to make Canada the 51st state, could he actually pull it off? Salute that subscribe button, and we'll see you in the next one.